In terms of, this is that green parcel that was less than 50 cents a square foot. That's this environment right here. The jail parking lot. And pay attention to the orientation of the parking, because in my proposals this will change. So make a note of what that looks like here. And in winter, it's looking like this. This is the back of the building. If we look down Front Street, this is Front Street on a Friday afternoon, during, not a holiday, during a normal day. And most of the parking occurs off the street. The parallel parking on the street's largely not utilized. And there's very little vehicle traffic down the street during the middle of the day. And then of course we have, looking at City Hall, which is the greenest of the parking lots with the most landscaping. Of course we know what that looks like, and I'm parked right here right now. Where is this project going? Where do the interventions begin first? Well, it seems to me, in my analysis of cities that had found a way to improve themselves, there are a number of assets that were suggested as cities pursuing that would help them improve themselves. Things like industrial parks, studio spaces, high-speed internet, telecommunications access, airport, and there's a lot of other things. Brainerd pretty much has all of those individual elements. A lot of other cities want those individual elements. Brainerd has most of those. And so one of the things that I identified as being an opportunity is making connections between these various assets. And so if you look at downtown, this area where the city made lots of streetscape improvement is a big asset. You have Gregory Square, which is a large asset. Historic Square. I think it's nice. As a visitor, maybe I'm wrong on that. The hospital, it's a regional medical center as far as I'm aware. You've got the ball fields and the parks that are attached to the high school, and there's trail that runs up through there and ends right here, and that will get you down to the Paul Bunyan Trail. And then of course you've got the high school and the library, which draws from a fairly large area. And so what we have is we have this kind of core historic part of downtown where there aren't very good connections outside of if you're using an automobile. There isn't any connection for people, for families to walk or bike or skateboard to access down to the high school in these parks. And there isn't very good connection if you come up into the rest of the downtown from this area. And Front Street is one of the quietest streets, at least this part of it is, within the entire downtown. And so there's an opportunity there for making use of that in a way that favors people who aren't necessarily driving an engine or driving a vehicle with an engine. So these initial proposals, what I'm proposing are basic program-based steps that are implementable in 3 phases. So here's some of these icons that you'd seen earlier. They're providing the basis for some of the proposals and some of the elements that I'm proposing that be used within the first phase. And these are simple, inexpensive things. Things like signage, innovative-looking seating elements, being more liberal and more inventive with the use of paint within the downtown environment, wayfinding signage that connects both to the downtown but to the larger city and trail systems, simply throwing artificial turf on the sidewalk in specific places. I was in San Diego recently, and there was a restaurant, just kind of like a sandwich shop. And out on the sidewalk, they just threw some of this down with chairs, and it completely changed the feel of that sidewalk environment. Just a simple, inexpensive thing to do that delineates this space for the restaurant, but softens it up a bit. Using chalk. Chalk festivals are huge in some places, or paint, just marking the sidewalk or the streets differently. My wife and I both bicycle. We try not to use the car in the Twin Cities because it's just crazy. We'd just be stuck in traffic most of the time, and we bike everywhere as much as we can. When we came up here, and as a couple, and I was investigating the city, we biked around, and that's how I learned the city was just biking around. But within the downtown environment, if I'm biking into town, there's not very many places for me to park my bike and lock it and then pop into a business and spend some money. And so since, again, this is a city that's anchoring that south end of the Paul Bunyan Trail, there isn't necessarily anything to communicate to people who would be coming from Bemidji on that trail that, hey, this is a desirable place to stay and spend some money, or that there's something happening here, because there's nowhere to safely lock up an $800 bike potentially. And then just trees and planters. So basic elements, and of course those aren't the only things. There's other things that you can do as well. But let's just look at the map here. So how does this begin to change within the first phase? Well, you're starting to see a lot more like markings of green on the map. And we're going to zoom into those and talk about what that means here right now. So on East River Road, we've begun to just paint parts of that road differently. We've begun to mark it differently, and it looks like that. So the road is still completely given over to automobiles. It's a 45-foot wide street. We want cars to use it, but if this is the best way to get from the neighborhood up here down to the ball fields 2 blocks away, we can just paint it a bit differently, and that communicates something about like safety and about getting to the park. I walked with Amy Ellingson around the downtown back in March, and she and I walked over here and we saw a guy bike past, and we saw a teenager on a longboarder within 20 minutes. And I asked her if she would ever let her kids come down here to get to the park, and she said, no way, not the way it is now. And so this is, so just seeing that painting it differently can completely change this. The road's still functional, but it's more functional than it was, and it's not a permanent change. That paint can go away as easily as it was put on. Within parking lots, now let's talk a little bit about parking lots. Parking lots are an asset. They are an investment. They can support heavy loads. They've got drainage built into them. Often they have power sources built into them. A lot of money has been spent to make them. They are an asset. But too much of a parking lot begins to work counteractively in the minds of people, because they're not at a scale that we can really relate to. A car is a much larger scale than a human being, and when you have large expanses of parking lot, that begins to change the desirability of a place in someone's mind. And so keeping the parking lots as they are, because they can support a lot of different uses, but maybe what we do is within some of that parking, we just do like a pocket park, a very temporary, seasonal changing of some of the surface of this environment. It's not permanent, it can go away, but it does communicate a couple things. It does soften up the environment a bit. If you are working in a business, if we go back here, if you're working in either of these businesses and you're on a lunch break, you can either stay inside the building or you probably have to drive away. Or if this is out there, suddenly you have a picnic space. Or it's a place to park your bike if you are actually coming in off the trail. Like I said, this isn't a permanent thing, but it does change the nature of it. And more importantly, it communicates to people driving by on 210 and 371, something's happening in Brainerd. As far as I can tell, everyone I've talked to wants something new to happen in Brainerd. This is an inexpensive way to communicate. We're trying some new things. It's not permanent. We'll see how you like it. Within the jail parking lot, notice it's changed a little bit. Before, it was all 90-degree parking, but we've changed this aisle here, making angled parking. Now, the reason we did this is what we want to do is we want to connect cyclists from East River Road and run them back along this facility and into downtown. Now, the reason that we can do this is that this is a 22-foot wide drive aisle, but there's only parking on one side. Okay, so really you only need a drive aisle that's about 15 feet wide, and that suddenly buys you about 8 more feet of space that you could program a little bit differently if you wanted to. Additionally, the backside of this building is an excellent canvas for actually highlighting the community or letting people advertise their business or doing something. If Brainerd, or if any city begins treating surfaces as canvas, you can begin doing some very interesting thing that communicates something's happening here, something that maybe supports the business efforts to get known, maybe supports efforts and artist efforts to get known, maybe supports the city's efforts to communicate some kind of a message. So nothing's really changed other than the surface markings and how we've programmed it. If we look at Front Street, you notice on this map, I've brought some of that green, where we've annexed kind of the pocket park thing in the parking lots. Well, I brought that into some of these underutilized parking spaces on the street. You could